Okay, hello everyone. Today we have the pleasure to have Professor S.P. Arun as our invited speaker. Arun is his first name and S.P. is the abbreviation of his last name. Arun received his bachelor's degree from IIT Bombay and his master's and the PhD degrees from Johns Hopkins University, all in electrical engineering. He completed his postdoctoral research at Carnegie Mellon University and joined the Center for Neuroscience at Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, where he is currently an associate professor. He is fascinated by how the brain transforms sensations into perception. And for more details, you can visit his homepage, and I will post the link in the chat. And Arun, the floor is yours. Thanks for joining us. Yeah.
Thank you, Minnie. It's a pleasure to talk to all of you. And please do feel free to stop if you have any questions or if you want to jump in with a comment. It's great when all these online meetings are more interactive than not. So let me start by sort of just introducing sort of our lab. This is the Vision Lab at IISc. So IISc is Indian Institute of Science. And the core question that we've been looking at in our lab is to understand how the brain solves vision. And it's a very fairly broad sort of question, of course. We do this through a variety of different experimental techniques. We've been studying visual perception in humans. This is what I'll be talking about for the most part of today's talk. We also do human brain imaging and plan to be doing some perturbation studies as well. We also do single neuron recordings from the monkey inferior temporal cortex. This is a region that is crucial for object recognition. And a sort of uniting theme behind all this work is the use of computational models to make sense of the data and sort of interpret and understand what's going on. So let me start with the basic sort of question, and this is really a talk that I want to build up from the first principles. And let's start with this common observation that we see here, which is that we can frequently describe objects using their parts. And the question then arises, can we understand all objects in terms of their parts? And immediately you can start imagining a few exceptions, right? And so, for example, there are objects that cannot be described using their parts. For example, this object looks fairly holistic. You won't necessarily be able to break them into parts. And there's also this logical sort of issue that you can, what do you even mean by a part? And so, but we leave that aside and just say that, well, in the case of the dog and the cat, it's pretty obvious that they have certain identifiable parts, whereas there are other objects which can't be really described in terms of their parts. And then there are other objects which have emergent properties like symmetry. For example, in this particular case, the two parts of the object, because they're identical and short of mirror reflection, they form this property of symmetry. And so no particular one part of the object actually carries this property. And so this is generally thought of as a holistic property. And so it's not a property of any one part of the object, but of the whole. So that's another kind of issue. And of course, the other kind of issue that we also would start, noticing if you start reading the literature in sort of object vision, is that there are special categories of objects, which are, for example, birds and faces over here. And these are objects where which we have the experience of recognizing instantly without really having to parse any of the parts. And the sort of question has been, do we form special whole object detectors which respond to the entire object and not really to the parts? So all of these issues surround this basic question of really how do we understand objects using their parts? And really the question arises, can we even understand objects using their parts? And is this possible to solve or not possible to solve? So let's get back to this basic initial observation. And we can say, if we want to understand objects using their parts, we need two ingredients, right? One is you need to create lots of objects containing the same repeating parts. And immediately you can see that there's somewhat problems with doing this kind of thing, because natural objects have very unique features and there's not necessarily a common set of repeating parts that are making up natural objects. But still, the hope is that we can create lots of objects containing the same repeating parts, and so that we can infer the effect of changing a single part of the object. That's really the underlying goal if you want to understand objects using their parts. The second ingredient that you also need is to have a quantitative and objective measure of how much perception changes when you change a part. And so these are the two key ingredients you need to do to even attempt to answer this question. So let's see how we go about doing that. The first step is, of course, how do we create the same objects? How do you create, you know how I hide this tab? Maybe I can remove it. Yeah. So what we want to do here is, can we create lots of objects using the same part? And if you start thinking about this problem, consider this for this image, for example, nice cartoon of an Indian farmer. And immediately, if you think about breaking this object down into parts, you're immediately faced with a couple of issues. And these couple of issues I'll collectively call as the curse of decompositionality. And so for a particular reason, the idea is that you're trying to decompose a natural object into its constituent parts. So immediately you're going to be faced with a couple of difficulties. The first difficulty is that there's no unique decomposition. So if you take this particular object and you want to break it down into parts, this is one reasonable decomposition, you might argue. There's of course more decompositions or more breakages you can make, and you can break down the object into lots and lots of parts. At the extreme, of course, you can break down the object into pixels, and that's of course a complete degeneration of the object into all tiny components. But there's all kinds of other decompositions out there, and there's no unique way to decompose the object into parts. So that's one issue that you've got to face when you're trying to understand the object using the parts. The second issue, and a more basic issue that you're going to face, is that there's a kind of combinatorial explosion of possibilities that you have to deal with. And so consider, for example, I'm taking this object and breaking it down into individual components. Let's just call them as x1, x2, x3, x4, and so on. And this is sort of the head, the neck, the face, the ears, and so on. But then immediately, the moment you enumerate a set of features that could be driving the response to the object, you're faced with the possibility that there could be pairs of features that could be also driving the response to the object. And so immediately you start having ends, if you enumerated, say, 10 features in the object, immediately you have 100 pairs of features and 1,000 triples of features and so on. So there's an explosion of possible influences of these combinations of features or the individual features that could contribute to the perception or the response to a part. So the question is, how do you actually even begin to solve this problem? And an approach that we have found very fruitful in trying to understand and solve this problem is what I would call now as a flipping this kind of question around to actually create objects which are made of identifiable parts. And so let me give you an example of that. I'm calling this very just colloquially, if you will, as the blessing of compositionality. And so this is the flip side of it. And basically what we do here is that we create a large set of objects which are created by combining a single contour on the left side and a single contour on the right-hand side. And we've designed these contours to have exactly the same termination point. So there are no new features being created when these two contours join together. And now what you can see here is that if you go along the row, the left contour is changing. And if you go down the column, the right contour is changing. And so now you can create a large number of objects. And now a very interesting thing happens here, which is that now suppose I take 7 left and 7 right contours. These could be any two contours, doesn't matter what they are, but the termination point should be the same, because then there's no new features created when you join them. Okay. Now, if you take 7 left and 7 right contours, you'll get 49 total object responses. And these 49 total object responses need now to be explained only by 7 left predictors and 7 right predictors. So only 14 predictors are in there. So what's happening is now that you have the reverse of the combinatorial explosion, where you can measure the responses to a huge number of objects, but the huge number of objects have been created from a very small number of parts. And the very small number of parts are the ones that will predict the response to the whole object. So this is the basic idea. And I'll pause here in case somebody has any questions before I go ahead. So I guess if there are none, I'll assume that this is all good, and maybe you can ask questions if you sort of think of something as we go along. Right? So this is the first step. So we wanted to create a situation where we create a huge number of objects using a small number of parts. And then if you do this, you're in a good situation, because you've now created a huge number of whole objects, which you can study using predictors which are based on a small number of components or parts. And you can test and build part-based models or component-based models that would actually predict the response to the whole object. Okay, so that's one ingredient. The second ingredient is somewhat simpler than this. And the second ingredient is simply to have an objective measure of how much perception changes when you change a part. And remember, again, if you think about it from the first principles, you take two objects and one object has a part that is changed compared to the other. And if you simply ask people how different these two objects are, this is a very subjective question, and there's no objective measure that you can actually put together to quantify how much perception is changing. So what we've been using in our lab over many, many years now is an approach which is based on a very natural kind of task. Let me give you an example of this task, which is actually a task that we even encounter in the natural world. So there's a snake hidden in the image in here, and I want you to sort of raise your hand if you see the snake in the image. And this is an excellent example of camouflage, right? And really illustrates the point that the object in question, the snake over here, is actually hard to find because it is similar to the surroundings. Okay, so this act of searching for the snake is actually a task based on the similarity of the object from the surrounding. And this is really, really hard. In fact, I also sometimes can't find the snake in here. Here's the snake, I've highlighted it. There's an entire set of reasons why the snake is so well hidden against the background. But the principle, the basic idea here is that finding a target in a visual search task indexes the similarity of that target relative to the background. And this is a very easy and objective measure of similarity, because you contrast this with the dissimilarity rating that you might ask a subject to actually produce. Visual search is a very natural task. Even children can do it. In fact, we've been making children do it in some of our studies. And it has an objective measure of performance. I know if my participants are actually doing the task because they're localizing the target, and they know where the target is. And so I can actually compare this with chance performance. I can rule out people who are not really doing the task properly, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is a nice task to use. And of course, in the lab, we won't use interesting displays like this, which capture our imagination, but rather boring displays like this, in which we have a single target that's different from identical distractors. And so here there's just the target that's differing in orientation. You can vary the orientation difference between the target and distractors, and you can make the search harder. And something that we realized very, very early on when we started testing visual search for this kind of purpose is that if you plot the reaction time against the difference in orientation between the target and distractors, you get actually this kind of nonlinear drop-off. Okay, and something very interesting happens when you take this nonlinear function and actually flip it. Okay, so if you think about this reaction time, the time you take to find the target, you can think of it as a measure of similarity. That is, if the target is more similar to the distractor, you'll take a longer time. So reaction time is proportional to similarity. But look at what happens when you actually take the inverse of the reaction time. And it turns out that this nonlinear function is almost exactly a 1/x function. Okay, and so therefore, if you take the reciprocal of the reaction time, you get a pretty nice linear function, which suggests that although reaction time is a measure of similarity, the reciprocal of reaction time is actually linear in terms of lots of feature differences. We've tested this for orientation, length, intensity, and so on. And you can think of 1/RT as a measure of dissimilarity. And the interesting thing is the reaction time is a nonlinear measure of similarity, whereas the inverse of reaction time is a linear measure of dissimilarity. And so we've started using the reciprocal of reaction time in a number of studies. There's a lot of things to say about reciprocal of reaction time itself. But let's pause for a moment to consider why is it that the reciprocal of reaction time is working like this. Okay, so let's consider a simple visual search task. And the question is, what does 1/RT mean physically? Because we're all used to thinking about the reaction time, the response time in a visual search task. And that's the basic measure that you actually measure in a visual search experiment, right? So then what does the reciprocal of reaction time mean? Well, consider this search array. And you have identical distractors, and imagine some sort of difference signal that is actually emerging from some corner of the visual search array, and it grabs your attention, and then of course you make a response. But the degree to which it grabs your attention depends upon the difference of this local salience of that target relative to the distractors. And so if you think about it, if the salience is very large, then you make a fast response, and if the salience is very small, you'll make a slow response. And so if you think about this very simple kind of model, there's a salient signal. And if the salient signal accumulates to a threshold really fast, then you get a fast reaction time. And if the salient signal is small and therefore accumulates very slowly, you'll get a slow reaction time. It's very, very intuitively obvious if you think about this basic model, that the reciprocal of reaction time is indexing the salience or the dissimilarity. And so that's the picture that I want you to keep in mind if you're thinking about the inverse of reaction time. Right? So now we are armed with two ingredients. We have a way of creating lots of objects using a small number of parts. We also have an objective measure of perceptual similarity, and it's linear and it has nice properties that I can tell you about. It behaves like a mathematical distance metric. We've tested all the properties of a mathematical distance. Yeah.
I would have thought that you need a constant in this equation.
Right. So
because there is a visual and motor delay.
That's right. So actually so initially we started using the kind of baseline reaction time task to estimate a kind of motor delay between the appearance of a stimulus and the response. And it turned out that actually you don't need to include this in your in all these models to actually so the model fit doesn't get any better because of using that baseline reaction time. And this is consistent with other studies that colleagues of mine are doing here and maybe in other places as well, where if you look in the motor system, there's no single point where it's a fixed delay after that. So like if you're making it's in a motor task, then there's a continuous transformation from the decision variable all the way down to the effector in the muscle. And apparently there's no fixed delay in this entire process. So I'm just taking, both practically in terms of when we are using this kind of baseline, or if you try to subtract a delay, and also sort of conceptually when we look at the literature in the motor system, it doesn't seem to be required, but it is odd. I do agree with that. Yeah. So let's go ahead now. And then the first question that we started out asking is, well, how do we understand how many parts combine? This is work that Pramod in our lab, who's a PhD student, and he's off doing a postdoc in MIT right now. And this is a study that we did lots of experiments that Pramod did. And the basic idea is this: we wanted to create artificial objects. And these are created by taking two completely random sets of parts and then sticking them together with a stem, connecting them. And the idea was that we could create a huge number of objects using a small number of parts. And you can see here that I've created 49 different objects by taking 7 left parts and 7 right parts, and they're combined in some particular way. And now we can start measuring the dissimilarities between these objects using visual search. So here's an example search array. There's one oddball present in the search array, and you can see that it's pretty easy to find the oddball. And so that means in perceptual space, the dissimilarity between these two objects is large. On the other hand, here's another example search array where the target is a little bit harder to find. And this means that the inverse of reaction time is small, which means that the objects are actually less dissimilar. And so you can start doing lots and lots of experiments of this kind. We've taken 49 objects, so you have 49 choose 2, which is 1,176 pairs of searches. And from these 1,176 pairs of searches, I can calculate, or I'm estimating, the perceptual distance of 1,176 observations, right? These are all pairs of objects which are present in this set. So now I can measure all these perceptual distances. And just for the purpose of visualization, I have all of these represented in a 2D space. The way we've done this is using a technique called multidimensional scaling. And the principle here is that we place 2 objects close by if it's a hard search. If 2 objects are far away, it's an easy search. And immediately you can start seeing patterns in this entire representation. For example, everything that has a crescent is close together. You also see that mirror images are actually close together, which means that in visual search, you can see pretty nicely mirror confusion. You can also see lots of other different patterns. And the basic question that we wanted to ask here is, can we explain object relations using part relations? Remember that there's a set of 49 objects, but they're created from only 7 parts. And these 7 parts are placed on both sides. These are identical parts placed on sides. So ultimately, this 49 objects are really created from 7 individual parts. So how do we build a model that actually takes part relations or part-part relationships and then predict object-object relationships? So here's what we set out to do. So here's an arbitrary pair of objects, A, B, and C, D. And what we thought is that maybe the net distance between an object containing parts A and B and another object containing parts C and D can be explained using all pairwise distances between the parts. So if you start listing them, we reasoned that they could actually fall into three groups. So one group is, for example, the relationship between the parts at corresponding locations of the two objects. So what that means is that we're assuming that the visual system is performing a comparison between the left parts of the two objects and the right parts of the two objects. Okay. Then you could also have a comparison process between the left part of one object and the right part of the other object. Since we call these as part relations at opposite locations. And because these two are two identical kind of terms, we group them together. Right. And then the third part, just for completeness, is the part relation or the dissimilarity between parts of the same object. That is, there's some kind of comparison process or something that's going on that compares the parts of the two parts of the same object. And so it turns out that all of these terms are actually required, and the model performs really great. And this turns out to be a linear model. So what happens is that I can just put a 0 or a 1, provided a particular part is present in that location or not. And then if you keep building this for lots and lots of pairs of objects, you will find a large linear set of equations to solve. And if you solve that set of equations, you will get model performance like this. This is what I'm plotting here is the observed dissimilarity in the y-axis. This is the reciprocal of reaction time. And the x-axis is the predicted dissimilarity. And you can see that there's a pretty nice fit between the model and the data, which is actually equal to the subject-subject consistency in the data as well, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is this model actually allows you to estimate or put down a separate set of part relations at each of these steps. And then the question was, is there something special about the way these part relations are organized in different ways, or are these all coming from the same set of part relations? And so if you plot these weights against each other, what you find is that all these weights are actually correlated, which means that all of these are derived from ultimately the same set of part relations. And you can now reconstruct these part relations and say, here is the underlying dissimilarity between the parts that is predicting the dissimilarity between the wholes. And so what we can then conclude from this very basic experiment is that the dissimilarity between objects is a linear sum of part differences, right? So if you want to compute the net dissimilarity between two objects, you compare the parts, you compare every possible pair of parts between these two objects, and you can produce the net dissimilarity between these objects, okay? So the moment you find a rule like this, well, what do you do as a responsible scientist? You break it, right? So he started looking for exceptions and things to break this rule. So this is the first thing that we tried out. We have two objects here which are made of, every part is different. So these two objects differ in three different parts. Then we said, what happens if you actually rotate one of these objects relative to the other, right? So this also will give you a perceptual distance. I can run a visual search, visual search experiment to compare the distance between these two objects and also between these two objects. So now we do this for a large number of objects where there's, I plot here the response time for normal pairs, which are not rotated with respect to each other, and the response time for variant pairs where these two objects are rotated with respect to each other. So the question is, what happens? And it turns out that you get a pretty nice correlation, okay? But there's an interesting feature that happens when you cast the same observation in terms of reciprocal of reaction time. So I'm plotting the same data now in terms of the reciprocal of reaction time. And look at what happens. There's a constant offset. What this means is that the net dissimilarity between two objects rotated by a small amount is actually the dissimilarity between the unrotated pair of objects plus this extra distance because of rotation. Okay, so what this means, and if I change the rotation, we were able to change the constant offset as well, which means that there's a very clear kind of additive process by which the two objects are being registered first and then being compared, right? So we repeated the same experiment on a different kind of attribute. So we have two pairs of a pair of objects over here. Again, the parts are different. Now I change the spatial relationship between these parts. Okay, and again, we do exactly the same experiment. I'm plotting the search reaction time for the normal pairs where the two parts are exactly in the same location. They're registered together. And then we are plotting the search time for the variant pairs where one object has parts like this and the other object has more distant parts between them. Okay, and so obviously the case where there's more differences should be faster, but if you plot this in terms of the reciprocal of reaction time or the search dissimilarity, you get a very nice, neat, constant offset. So what does that mean? Apparently what your visual system is doing is to take two objects and then do some sort of registration process by which these parts are fluid and sort of compared with each other in some way. And then you do a process of detailed part by part comparison. So that's what we concluded from this experiment, that net dissimilarity between objects is the sum of parts plus any global differences between these parts. So you can see immediately that the object representation is highly systematic and it's following certain rules, but it's not really working as a simple sort of net, distance computation. There's something more detailed and organized going on. Okay, so that was the sort of net conclusion from all these studies, that how do we explain the dissimilarity between multiple sets of objects, and the answer is that all these parts are combining in some linear fashion. All of these differences are coming together and summing linearly. Okay, so then the next question is, well, earlier I was doing this with objects where the parts were disconnected from each other or far from each other. What about holistic objects like I showed you just in the beginning? So these are objects that don't look like they contain parts. And so here's a set of objects which we created by taking the left contour and the right contour. I see a question. Do you want to ask now?
On the part where you say, how do many parts combine? So far, you've only shown experiments with pairs of parts, and I was wondering if you generalized it to more, to 3 parts or more in an object.
We've done it for 3 parts. In other experiments, which I'll show you, which actually Akash has done, we've done this for words where we have much longer strings, which are sort of, you can think of as containing many, many more parts. But in the case of simple visual objects, we've taken only up to 3 parts. But our assumption is that this will actually work for even larger sets of, even larger numbers of parts, although the models become much more complicated because of that, because you have many more pairwise distances between parts to worry about. Yeah. So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. So we have this set of objects now, which is very interesting to us because none of these would be actually what you would call as containing parts. They're all looking holistic. You can't really break it down. And of course, the ones along the diagonal are kind of even more special because they're like circles and triangles, which really don't look like they contain parts. So the question then is, does this part-based model work for these holistic objects where you don't really see them as containing parts? Whereas in the earlier case, we had these objects which are very clearly containing parts. And so therefore, maybe that parts-based model is working there. So the question is, does it work here? And it turns out that it works beautifully over here. And that the observed dissimilarity is very nicely matched with the predicted dissimilarity. And what we can therefore conclude is that the object dissimilarity, even for holistic objects, is a sum of parts, right? So that's the second sort of question. And the third then question is, what happens for symmetric objects, right? Because now we have a situation where I can create whole objects with lots of combinations of parts. And what happens when these combinations of parts are special, right? So it turns out that in the same set of objects that I showed you earlier, the diagonal of that matrix of stimuli that I showed you earlier contains symmetric objects because the same part was present on the left side and right side. Okay, so then the question is, what is happening for symmetric objects? So let's sort of slow down here for a second. And we'll say that suppose symmetry is a special property, right? Suppose it's a holistic property that's been computed for these objects. Then a parts-based model, which does not know symmetry, should not be able to explain the relations between symmetric objects because symmetric objects are having some kind of deviation, right? And so that's our prediction, that maybe if you look at pairs of symmetric objects, the error for these symmetric objects must be larger than the error for the asymmetric objects, because asymmetric objects are not special, but symmetric objects have this holistic nature, and therefore maybe some symmetry detection is going on. Therefore, there should be larger error for these symmetric objects. Sorry if I'm talking too fast. Please tell me if I'm talking too fast and I'll slow down. Yeah. So now we plot the same data as we did before. We have the observed data on the y-axis, the predicted data on the x-axis, and now I'm highlighting a set of red points which represent the distances between symmetric objects. And it turns out that distances between symmetric objects were no different in terms of their error compared to other objects. What this means is that even symmetric objects, right, the distances between symmetric objects are also explained using a sum of the parts. So then this poses a kind of puzzle for us, right? Because on the one hand, we know that symmetry is a very special property. And something is special about symmetric objects. They're more memorable. We appreciate them in our art and so on. And then, and on the other hand, when we looked at these behavioral experiments, and we also had a corresponding set of neural experiments from recordings of single neurons in IT cortex. And in both those cases, we did not see specifically different error in terms of these parts-based models for symmetric objects. So the question is, what's happening? What's special about symmetric objects? So what we then found is that symmetric objects are different in a particular way. They may not be different in the way their parts sum together. Their distances are also explained just like any other object, but they are different in a very particular way. And just to show you why or how that works, here's a search array, and you can see that, and there are actually two oddballs. There are two odd one out items in this search array. Rest of them are identical. And you can see that the symmetric object is pretty easy to find, and the asymmetric object is not so easy to find. So question is, why is this happening and how is this happening, right? So first of all, to confirm the behavioral validity, so we did this experiment lots of times, and it turns out that symmetric objects are more distant from each other compared to symmetric objects, compared to asymmetric objects, which are of the same nature. So the question is, why is it that symmetric objects are more distant or more different from each other compared to other types of objects? What is actually driving this kind of behavior? Because we've also shown that symmetric objects are not different in terms of the way their parts sum together. Okay, so here's the basic idea that we sort of came up with. And the basic idea is, imagine that you have an object which is symmetric, right? Now imagine that neurons that respond to this, to the two parts of this object have the same part selectivity at both locations. So then the response to an object that has two identical parts is basically A plus A, where A is the response to one of the objects and A is the response to the other part of the object. And so the net response is always, remember, part summation. So the net response to object containing two parts A and A is just 2A. Now you take another symmetric object, the response to that is 2B. Right? And but now notice what happens is, if you take an object that contains the parts A and B, which is a asymmetric object, then the net response is A plus B, which will be somewhere along the line joining 2A and 2B. Right? So this is just by definition. You take any vectors in some multidimensional space, you sum two vectors and you'll get 2A, and then you sum two other thing and get 2B, and so that's the basic idea. Right? So now if you imagine that asymmetric objects are actually falling along a line joining the two symmetric objects, and then you do this for 3 total symmetric objects, what you will find is that the asymmetric objects AB, AC, and BC are all coming closer together than the symmetric objects AA, BB, and CC. Okay, and the basic principle that's really driving this behavior is that neurons respond to the same part on both locations in the same way. That is, they have the same part tuning on both sides of the object. Okay, and so the basic idea here is that it's a bit like mixing paints. If you mix 2 reds, it remains red. If you mix 2 greens, it remains green. If you mix 2 blues, it remains blue. But if you mix red and green, green and blue and yellow and so on, you start getting very, very similar colors. And that's really what's happening with asymmetric objects and symmetric objects. Okay, so that's a basic property difference between symmetric objects and asymmetric objects. So now we thought, well, if this is all what's really happening, then can we really understand the perception of symmetry using this property? And so what we thought is that maybe in some sort of abstract space or in the space of objects, you might have a decision boundary where you're calculating the distance of each object from the center, or sort of the average dissimilarity of an object from all other objects. Okay, so now if you do this, then it will turn out that the asymmetric objects are actually all quite similar to each other, whereas the symmetric objects are far apart. Okay, and so what this means is that if you calculate some sort of abstract sort of property, all the asymmetric objects are close to each other and the symmetric objects are far away from all of them. And so we call this property as distinctiveness. Okay, so the basic idea is that distinctiveness is a kind of decision variable, and symmetric objects are standing far apart in this constellation of objects, and therefore they're more distinctive. Okay, so if this is really the case, then we thought, if you're using symmetry as a if you want to decide if an object is symmetric or not, you could just measure the distance of that object from all other objects. And if the distance is large, you'll say it's symmetric. If the distance is small, you'll say it's asymmetric. So this is a prediction that we made. The prediction was, if you were making people do a task to detect the symmetry of an object, right? Then the time they take to detect the symmetry must be having a specific relationship with this underlying decision variable, right? Because if you take objects that are near the decision boundary, you'll take a long time to decide if these objects are symmetric or asymmetric. Whereas if you take objects that are far away from the decision boundary, then you should get actually fast reaction times, right? So this is the basic idea. So for example, and this specifically predicts that if you plot the reaction time for a symmetry detection task for asymmetric objects as a function of this distinctiveness, this is just the average distance of that object from all other objects, right? And if you plot this, you'll get a positive correlation for asymmetric objects and a negative correlation for symmetric objects, right? Is that clear? I don't know if I'm going kind of too fast or... Okay.
I think it's clear, but the axis of distinctiveness is not a linear combination of the previous ones, right? It's more like a distance from the center of the space or something like that.
Right. So if you calculate distance from the center of the space or the average distance of every object from all other objects, you get a very tightly correlated answer. So we just took the distance of each object from all other objects. There's the average distance of an object from every other object.
I see. Yeah, but so you do have to assume that there's some kind of nonlinear computation here. You add a new feature, which is distinctiveness.
That's right. Yeah.
Thank you.
So now what we did was you take now all these objects in a symmetry detection task, right? So this is the prediction. And then we said, okay, for these same objects, we perform two tasks. One task is where I show a single object and then I make people do a symmetry detection. So I say, press a key if the object is symmetric, press another key if the object is not symmetric, right? Then the other task that I make people do is to actually do this visual search task where they're looking for pairs of every possible pair of these objects, right? And the question is now, can one task be explained from some derived measure from the other task? And it turns out that this actually works really nicely. I mean, so here's the symmetry detection time as a function of visual search distinctiveness. And you get a positive correlation for asymmetric objects and a negative correlation for the symmetric objects. We've done this now for another set of objects, and again, the same sort of pattern still stands. There's a negative correlation for symmetric objects and a positive correlation for asymmetric objects. Now, you'll notice that these correlations are not very strong. We think that the reason is because this is only one of the processes you might be using for detecting symmetry. What we think is that this is a quick and dirty way to understand if an object is symmetric or not. But if you want to really understand if the object is symmetric or asymmetric, you'll have to do a detailed comparison of the parts, and that may be triggering a different kind of process altogether. But at least the initial quick and dirty estimate of whether the object is symmetric or asymmetric can just come from looking at the representation of the object. You don't need to really go and do something. All you need to do is to look at how far the object is from some center of the representation, right? So coming back to this question of how do parts combine, is symmetry a kind of special property? Well, it turns out that symmetry is not really special in terms of how the parts combine, but actually in terms of how the consequences of the summation of parts. So there's some kind of consequence which is making symmetry special, but not in terms of the property of symmetry being coded in some special way. So that's what we concluded from this study, right? So another question that we also asked based on the same sort of theme is to say, do we see some parts in an object but not others? And so let me kind of walk you through this sort of idea. You take this object out here. You have this intuitive notion that somehow this object contains these two parts, and we call this a natural part decomposition. And on the other hand, this object can be also thought of as broken down in a vertical cut. That is, you can cut the two parts in a vertical way. And this we would call as an unnatural decomposition. And of course, there's been some psychophysical evidence showing that that objects are indeed decomposed into specific parts. But we wanted to find out whether this happens automatically in a visual search kind of situation. So how do we go about answering this question? Well, we created two sets of objects, okay? So in one set of objects, the left and the right parts were changing. In the other set of objects, the top and the bottom parts were changing. And we designed these two sets of objects such that the diagonal of these two sets are actually exactly the same. Okay, so these are the objects common to both sets. And the question is, now if I build a model to explain the responses of these objects or the dissimilarities between these objects using the unnatural set or the natural set, which one predicts the distances between the common objects better? Okay, so that was the basic question. And so if you look at the whole model using unnatural parts, you'll see that there's the red objects are the ones of interest because those are the ones that are common in both the sets. And so if you do this for the unnatural part set, you'll see that the common objects are predicted not so great. But if you take the natural part set, the common objects are actually predicted pretty nicely. I mean, at least significantly better than the unnatural set. So what this means is that in visual search, we never ask people to actually break down the object into parts, but we can infer that they're probably preferentially breaking the object down into one set of parts, but not the other set of parts. Okay, so there's a little bit of time left, and I was thinking of talking about a little bit of Akash's work. So I don't know, should we do that? Okay,
I have a question about what you just said.
Sure. Yeah, please go ahead.
So you're suggesting that when we're seeing an object, we're going to divide into parts using this kind of perhaps negative curvature information.
Yeah. Right.
So how do we do about holistic objects? Because what I understand is the same process with holistic object or not.
So what I think the picture that comes from all these experiments is that we are actually arbitrarily combining parts to create an object, and all these models are working. What I think is really underlying this whole picture is that if I had taken, a top bottom cut, you notice that this unnatural sort of part model is also working pretty well in terms of those gray dots, and even the red dots are being predicted to some degree. So what I think is really happening is that the object is being broken down in a kind of collection of features of some kind, and there's no, maybe there's a preferential breakdown in terms of these natural parts, but there's still a breakdown going on. And so that breakdown is being captured by these part-based models, right? But yeah, it's a good question. Why is it that these arbitrary kind of part models are working? Because there was nothing very special about the way we combine these parts. They could have been some other collection of parts, and that also should have worked. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, great. So the question is, do we see some parts in an object but not others? And the answer is yes, there is some preferential breakdown towards certain types of parts, but that's not a very strong preference actually, coming back to that basic question that you asked. So then the final part that I want to talk to you about, and I'll try to go a little quickly so that we have time for discussion, is the question of how do letters combine when you learn to read? And of course, this is something that I know a lot of work in some of your groups also goes on. And let's see, I think a lot of what we are doing is sort of adding to sort of this whole thought process of what is happening to letters when you learn to read. Right. So this is all work with Akash. I think many of you know him already, and also with Professor KVS Hari, who is a professor in electrical communication engineering at the same institute. And there's a series of studies that have come out from Akash's work, and I'm going to only talk about one of them. And I think I don't need to tell this audience that there's a when you're learning to read, an entirely new brain area is created in your brain as a result of learning to read, and it responds more to printed words compared to other objects or scrambled words. All of you know this. Now, but there's still a kind of question about what's happening to letters as you learn to read, and this is what we wanted to investigate in our studies. And so let me lay out sort of two different possibilities. The first is a kind of what I would call the combination detector hypothesis. So the hypothesis here is that when you look at a word like clock, you're breaking this down in your early visual areas into small, tiny components. And all these components are being put together into these letters. And then you're probably forming these detectors for pairs of letters, or probably the entire word at a time. And then the reason you detect words so quickly is because words are becoming, they're specialized detectors for these words that are being formed. And the key idea of this hypothesis is that words are going to become less predictable from letters, because now there are unique responses to words which are not explained by the individual letters. On the flip side, we devised what we called the compositionality hypothesis. And the idea here is that you look at the word clock and you're easily able to parse the letters of the word clock into the individual components. And so here the prediction is that the words are going to become more predictable from letters and not less. And you can see that this is the key difference between these two ideas. In one idea, there's a new kind of detector that's been found for a whole word. And the other idea is that when you look at a whole word, which is very frequent or which you've seen a lot of times before, you're able to break it down better. Okay, and that allows your word to become more predictable from the same set of letters. But anyway, if you think about these two hypotheses, that's the question is, how do we test or discriminate between these two types of ideas or hypotheses? So first of all, we started with sort of a more basic question. How do we even measure purely visual processing abilities? Because we wanted to know, well, what happens when you learn to read? And so the question is, well, what happens to letters as you learn to read? And we wanted to understand what's happening to the visual processing of letters. And so we selected a particular situation in India, which is unique to India. The situation is like this. There are two states in India where people learn completely different scripts. But those scripts are actually attached to the same exact sounds. And so we picked a common set of letters in these two languages. And these letters have different shapes, but the sound associated with those letters is exactly the same. And of course, both these states have people who are highly educated and they come to study in our institute. And so we have a nice captive population of people. One group of people knows this language Malayalam, and the other group of people knows this language Telugu. And it becomes a great way to compare the effect of reading on visual processing, because almost everything else is the same, because the phonetics are the same, and they're all highly educated. There's no confounds because of literacy and so on and so forth. So that was a situation that we were able to exploit because of being in India. And so now what we decided to say is, well, a couple of questions, right? First of all, does reading fundamentally alter letter perception? So how do we do this? Well, we have an example search. This is shown for Telugu language. And we can make both sets of people. We can make the Telugu readers and the Malayalam readers both do the same task, because this is a task that does not require learning the language. It's just detecting the oddball, right? And we can measure the dissimilarity between every possible pairs of letters. And here's a kind of interesting result that we came up with. If I take Telugu letters, the people who can read Telugu actually are faster in doing the Telugu searches. Right? And the people who can read Malayalam letters are actually faster to read the Malayalam letters, faster to search for Malayalam letters. And if you look at their baseline sort of response time, that is on some independent sort of set of shapes, they're actually equally fast. So there's no group difference, but there's a very neat kind of double dissociation, suggesting that readers are becoming faster at discriminating letters of their own script, which is all nice. But there's still a basic, even more basic question, which is, does reading actually fundamentally alter letter dissimilarity? So for example, I can now say, I can measure the dissimilarity between letters for non-readers and the dissimilarity for readers, right? So if reading is fundamentally sort of changing your visual processing all over the place, then you should see no correlation between the dissimilarity for readers versus non-readers, right? On the other hand, if reading is only subtly altering the letter dissimilarity, that is, it's not really making things all over the place and it's not reorganizing your perceptual processing of these letters, then you should see a nice correlation between these two. And it turns out, and this data I'm showing you only for Telugu letters, you can see that search dissimilarity for readers is highly correlated with the search dissimilarity for non-readers. Okay, suggesting that reading is not actually altering letter representation, but it's making it subtly altering letter representation. Right? It's not making, two letters that look very similar to you are not becoming hugely dissimilar for the reader, things like that. But you can see a small effect over here, which is that letters, for example, like this pair of letters, which are very slightly different from each other, the Telugu readers who can read these letters are actually showing a slightly larger dissimilarity, which means that they're able to discriminate between small changes in these letters, which makes sense as well, because they're practiced at reading these letters lots and lots of times, right? But the basic question, of course, the basic answer here, of course, is that reading is only subtly altering letter representations, and readers are discriminating similar letters only slightly better, right? So then, of course, that's one part of the answer. We wanted to also know whether reading is altering something at a higher level. right? And that's again what we want to predict using the the whole object detector kind of hypothesis. So here's the question. So here are the kind of searches that we make people do. So here's an oddball target, and now the search target is a pair of letters, and the search distractors are also a pair of letters. Okay, and we can now build the same kind of model as we did before, and we say, can we explain the dissimilarity between two bigrams as a function of the dissimilarity between letters? And now this is a model which knows only about letter-letter dissimilarities. It does not know about bigrams at all. And so now we can say, if the dissimilarity between bigrams is now explained using the dissimilarity between letters, then we can say that there's no special bigram detectors, or there's no special processing of bigrams that's going on. And this is what we found in the data. This is the Telugu readers on Telugu bigrams, and it turns out that the observed dissimilarity is very nicely correlated with the predicted dissimilarity. And the errors are not different for high frequency bigrams versus low frequency bigrams and so on. And it turns out that in general, bigrams are explained equally well using single letters for both readers and non-readers. And so there's no greater errors in readers as you would be predicting from bigram detectors, at least at this level. Right? But then notice that something interesting has happened here, which is that I can now show that the readers are doing letter searches faster. They're also doing bigram searches faster, but there's no difference in the model fit, which means that the model parameters must be different. And if you look at the model parameters, something very interesting comes out, which is that both for Telugu and Malayalam bigrams, there's a specific change in the within bigram dissimilarity that has happened between readers and non-readers. And what you can see also is that readers are actually experiencing less interaction between the bigrams of between the letters of a single bigram. Okay, and this less dissimilarity is causing the bigram to become more separable, because the two letters in a bigram don't interact. So in other words, the default is that they would interact, and reading actually causes them to interact less. Okay, and I think I should skip a little bit ahead because of their sort of short of time. And so basically what we find is that readers are actually better on transposed bigrams, and also we can predict the fluency of readers using this model. That is, if you fit a model for every reader and you also measure the reading fluency, it turns out that if a reader is faster at reading, when you make them read a paragraph and see how fast they read, their reading ability or fluency is predicted by the degree to which this within bigram interactions are changing. That is, faster readers have fewer or weaker interactions between bigrams of a single, between the letters of a single bigram. Okay, and this predicts reading fluency. So I think that's all I had. How do letters combine when you learn to read? Apparently more linearly. And this is what was very interesting to us, that its reading is actually increasing the compositionality rather than decreasing it. And so to summarize what all I've shown you, the brain uses a compositional code to represent whole objects. I hope that's clear, that there's a very systematic kind of process going on. And then the other thing I also want to sort of highlight to all of you is that compositional sorts of designs can be a really nice way to probe object perception. So let me give you a couple of new designs to think about. You can do, for example, if you want to study faces, you can manipulate the shape of the parts independently of the configuration of the parts. And now you can study holistic processing of faces. You can also take object pictures and object words and then combine them in a combinatorial fashion, and then look for special processing of these congruent object picture pairs. And so these are all the kinds of things that we've been trying out to see if this whole idea of compositional designs can help us understand special sorts of processing and holistic properties and so on and so forth. So I'll end with that. This is our lab. Please do get in touch if you're interested in this kind of stuff. These are all the awesome people that I get to work with, and these are all the funding agencies that are paying us to do what we love to do. Yeah, thank you.